Okay, so this video is to look at the ratio of marginal utility to price. So it's kind of extending this idea of utility and how we can use it in our decision making. So remember from the reading, utility is really just a theoretical measure that addresses our happiness or well-being. We look at consuming some sort of good. If it makes us feel better, we say, okay, our total utility has increased. So like a lot of these other concepts that we've talked about, whether it's total benefits, total cost, that sort of thing, when we talk about utility, we talk about total utility, and of course we talk about marginal utility. So the idea of marginal utility is pretty important. So when we just look at comparing two different goods, we generally know which one we prefer. So whatever we prefer is the good that has a greater total utility than the other good. So in general, these kind of pairwise comparisons is pretty straightforward to say what we prefer. But the trick now is in our context of resource scarcity and decision making, and because we tend to use dollars as our unit of measure, we need to take that idea of the marginal utility and somehow incorporate the idea of money, of dollars, okay? And that's what we're going to do. So what we're going to do is take this idea of marginal utility, incorporate the price of the good, and then say, what do we choose? So ultimately what we're doing is we're attaching a kind of value to the idea of utilities, a value independent of what the utility is, but a value kind of related to if we have a fixed amount of income, what's the best way to spend our money? Okay, so what we're going to do is look at apples first, just apples. So here I have a table for apples. So we have a price of apples. The price of apples is $2.50 a bushel. So our chosen unit for looking at apples is in terms of bushels. Okay, so I have quantity of apples measured in bushels. So you have 0, 0.5, 1, 1.5, and 2. And for each of those amounts of apples measured in bushels, we have a measure of total utility. So if we consume no apples, we have 0 utility. Half a bushel, we're going to have 50 units of utility, etc., etc. So you notice total utility is going up as we increase our consumption of bushels of apples. Okay? So next thing we have to do is look at the marginal utility. So I have up here, marginal utility is simply the change in total utility divided by the change in the quantity. Okay? So in this case, we're looking at what's the change in the total utility from consuming apples divided by the change in the amount of apples consumed. So we'll just do a couple of quick calculations. So the change in utility is simply going to be 50 units of utility minus 0 divided by 0.5 bushels minus 0 bushels. So we're talking about what's the change in our utility when we go from consuming no apples to half a bushel. Okay, so we do the division, 50 divided by 0.5, we get 100. So our marginal utility in going from 0 bushels to 0.5 bushels is 100 units of utility. So we'll just do a second calculation just to kind of reinforce the calculation idea. So in going from 0.5 to 1, our total utility goes up from 50 to 88. So again, we'll do the calculation. So 88 minus 50. So that's the change in total utility divided by the change in the quantity. So that's 1 minus 0.5. We get 38 divided by 0.5, and that gives us 76. And like everything we do in my class, once we generate a number, we need to interpret that value. So if we look at that 100, it's 100 over 1. So the interpretation of this number is basically if we increase our consumption of apples by 1 bushel, our utility should increase by 100 units. When we go from 0.5 to 1 bushel, we generate a marginal utility of 76. Again, we can put that over 1. If we increase our consumption of apples by 1 unit, by 1 bushel, our utility should increase by 76 units. And then you can, if you want, you can calculate the remaining 2 cells. Okay, so we've got this idea of marginal utility. It's still tied to the actual quantity. But the thing is, even though these quantities are easy to think about, prices often change. So the next step is to try and figure out, okay, how do we incorporate this idea that we have to spend money to get that bushel, okay? So we want to incorporate the price per bushel of apples into this idea of marginal utility, and we do that by using the ratio of marginal utility to price. So let's do the calculation first, and then look at what it means. So this is a pretty straightforward calculation. We're just taking that marginal utility, dividing it by the price. So that's $2.50. And if we do the calculation, the value is 40. And I'm going to just say 40 over $1. So we'll do the second calculation of marginal utility to price. And again, we have that change in the total utility, that marginal utility, divided by the price. It's still $2.50 per bushel. And the number we end up with is 30.4 over $1. Okay? So now we have two different ratios of marginal utility to price. So what does this tell us? Well, because we're dealing with a change in utility that results from the consumption of a good, we can actually kind of look at what are actually all the steps. Okay? We're talking about, well, we'll just do the straight interpretation first. If I spend another dollar on apples, then I would expect my utility to increase by 40 units. So this is basically saying $1 buys us 40 additional units of utility. If we consume some apples, obviously our marginal utility changes. We get a new ratio of marginal utility to price. You get 30.4 over 1. And this is telling us if we spend the next dollar, if we spend an additional dollar on apples, we should see our increase in, we should see an increase of total utility of 30.4 units of utility. Okay? So again, this is both these ratios, just the ratio in general is telling us what do I get for spending a dollar. And so the mechanism is I spend a dollar, I get some apples, I consume those apples, I generate utility. So with all those steps, it's really kind of all incorporated into this ratio of marginal utility to price. If I spend another dollar on apples, I'm going to get 30.4 units of additional utility.